This is Join Us in France, episode 406, 406. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel to France. Today I bring you a conversation with Elise Riven of Toulouse Guided Walks about everyday life in France. This is at the request of my patrons. I know a lot of you have this idea, perhaps far in the back of your mind, that one day you might want to live in France. So what is life in France like? Is it very different? Well, yes and no. I've lived most of my life in France since I was born and raised here. But I've also lived in London for a couple of years and in the US for 16 years. I moved home to France in 2005, so it's been 17 plus years, but I have family by marriage in the US. We go back and visit them once a year when there's no pandemic, and I love going back, and so it's not entirely foreign to me. But being raised in France and then leaving and coming back, it gives you a different eye on your own country. It's a different perspective on things. I think you'll enjoy this episode. Let me know if we missed any major differences between France and the US. I think it'll make for an interesting conversation. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my itinerary consult service and my GPS self-guided tours of Paris on the Voice Map app. And you can browse all of that at my boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. I want to read just a couple of quick reviews of one of my tours, the Latin Quarter tour. Somebody wrote, one of the best Parisian tours so far, great stories and very good spots to visit. We took a little longer than usual because you stop on the way to grab something to drink or eat. Must recommend. And another person also about the Latin Quarter wrote, fantastic tour. I love the freedom of being able to stop and start at my own discretion. Annie's descriptions are clear and engaging. Thank you, whoever you are, both of you. And if you're on the Facebook group, mention how you enjoyed my tours is very much appreciated. As a matter of fact, please mention any tour or services you enjoy while in France, not just mine. The only rule is that you must have experienced it yourself. I don't want you to go by the recommendation of someone famous. I want you to talk about the tours and services you've enjoyed. For the travel question of the week, after my chat with Elise, let's talk about bread and butter. There's a lot to say about that, actually. There's also a French tip of the week after the chat with Elise, and this one is a pronunciation question. About the France boot camp, May 21st until May 27th, 2023. I have made a lot of progress, and I'm getting to the point where I need to know who's serious and who's not. So we're going to ask for a deposit for the language school and for the afternoon activities. All the details are going to be laid out in another 10 days. Can you be patient and wait that long? At that time, I'll send you a link to a page on joinusinfrance.com that will have all the details. And I will share that link with all the people who filled out the Google pre-registration form and also to everyone on my email list. And yes, there is a newsletter to go along with this podcast. I don't email often enough at all, but I will do better someday, I promise. But I do want to only write when there's something really important to say. But when there's something important like news about the bootcamp, it'll be in the newsletter, and you can sign up for it at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. Bonjour, Elise.
Bonjour, Annie.
We have a fun conversation today. We want to talk about everyday life in France.
Yes, indeed.
And we had to make a list because when I first proposed it, actually, several of my patrons who asked that we talk about everyday life in France. And I know we sprinkle that sort of stuff into all the episodes, but this one is just about that.
Just about how we live.
Yes, how we live. Maybe differences about life, everyday life in America versus everyday life in France, although it's been a long time since I've lived in America.
Me too.
It's been even longer since you've lived in America. But I do go visit, and you go visit.
I go visit too.
So hopefully we can still remember all of that. Okay, so we made a list in no particular order, but a lot of these things have to do with just how we live. For instance, French people eat at set meal times.
Yes.
This is really important, right?
Extremely important.
Right. So French people get ornery if it's 12:30 and they haven't had their lunch yet. They want to eat.
And lunchtime is very much between 12 and 2 p.m. This is really, I mean, other countries have a little later lunchtime, Spain maybe a little bit later, but it's very interesting to see when you go, especially if you're a working person, lunchtime begins at noon. That's just the bottom line. There's no exception to that. And you come back to work, depending on whether you work in an office or whether you work in a school like I did, you usually have either 1 hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours for lunch, which by American standards is a lot of time.
Right, because most Americans, I think it's still half an hour.
I think it's a half an hour or 45 minutes.
And also in France, you don't eat at your desk.
Never, never, never.
Right. So this is something, I mean, if you work at a corporation, my daughter works at a fairly big company right now called CEA, and she knows of one lady in her office who eats at her desk, and she's very shy, and she's from Germany, and she would rather just bring her own lunch and eat by herself at her desk. And everybody notices that, and everybody thinks it's odd.
Yes, I think that's because food and eating is a highly social activity in France, and it's considered to be antisocial if you don't join the group going out for lunch. And the other thing is, and this is something that's connected to the economics of the two countries, many people who are salaried people have some of what is called restaurant. And it's basically a ticket that gives you a reduction on what you have to pay in a restaurant, whether it's the company restaurant or outside, like when I was teaching. And it helps you pay for your lunch. So you have less excuse for not going out for lunch.
Right. This is something they started, I think, in the 80s or something, where they wanted to encourage more people, because back then, French people would go home for lunch. And I remember my dad coming home to eat lunch with us almost every day. Yeah, when he wasn't working away, you know, sometimes he was on assignment somewhere else, but usually he would just drive to the workshop and come home for lunch and go back. It wasn't very far, so he did that. But then they started wanting to support restaurants. They wanted to entice people to go to the restaurant. So they gave you a card. Well, at first it was paper checks in kind of a booklet, and you would just pay part or even all of your meal at the restaurant with those checks. By now, it's a credit card, but it's the same idea.
Well, in the Beaux-Arts, when I was still teaching there, it was the checks. It was a chèque restaurant, and each company or establishment decides how much they want to pay into each one. So, for instance, ours were 7 or 8 euros, and the typical lunch was 14 or 15 euros. So it paid for half.
Right. And also you get those checks. So if the face value of the check is 10, you've only paid 5 typically.
Yes, out of your own pocket, out of your salary.
So it's a really good deal. And during the pandemic, because all of the restaurants stopped, and I think even before the pandemic, they started making it possible for people to use those checks in grocery stores.
Yes.
But this encouraged a lot of people to go out to lunch instead of going home to lunch. And so nowadays, pretty much anybody who works, I mean, we have a lot of restaurants in France that are just open at lunchtime.
That's true. And I have to admit that I was teaching in New York before I moved back to France, where I had been before. And when I was teaching in New York, we had a teacher's room, and I used to bring my lunch every day and ate it in the teacher's room. And I did not go out to lunch. And it took me a while to get used to the idea that I was supposed to go out to lunch.
Right, right.
And it is very interesting because you do see lots of places that fill up at lunchtime just because of that.
Right. And we live in a village, and a bigger village next to us has a restaurant that's just open at lunchtime. And it really fills up. Like noon, it starts being full. And usually these places will have some kind of a buffet for appetizers and a buffet for dessert and a main dish. or 2 or 3. And so you go, you decide, do I want the appetizer buffet? Do I want the dessert buffet? Do I want just the main dish? Which main dish? I mean, it's very simple, and you're in and out in an hour.
Right.
And it's cost effective. I would go with my husband, and you have people, I see people coming in there with, like, they're wearing stuff like they work in healthcare, like I don't know what you,
Blouson, the white blouse.
they're dressed like they just came out of some healthcare science. You have people who are obviously painters because they have paint on their clothes. I mean, you have all sorts of people, and they just go there for lunch. And these places are usually a really good value. It's just that they don't advertise. They never have a website.
No.
So I can't send you to them because, like, it's just locals.
I have to confess that it's my husband's favorite kind of restaurant because you can usually eat all you want, you know.
The appetizer buffet, you could go as much as you want. Yeah.
But they're basically workers' restaurants. They're not high end, but they're perfectly fine. But the other thing about the difference between eating in the States and eating meals in France, and again, this may have changed, but I know from listening to people and talking to people, in France, it's still extremely important in the evening for everyone who lives together in the same family or the same house to eat together. That is not the case a lot in the United States.
Yes. Yes. I've never seen a French family where people just say, just eat whatever you want out of the fridge.
Exactly.
No.
Never. It just doesn't happen here.
Somebody is organizing a meal. Now, is it a fancy meal? Not necessarily.
Right.
But somebody is organizing something. So that's a very big, meal times. And this matters to you listeners because when you come to France, you should not decide to be hungry at 4 p.m. somewhere weird. If you're in Paris, it doesn't matter. But if you are, I don't know, if you're visiting the Dordogne and you would like a nice meal at 4 p.m., it ain't going to happen.
It is not going to happen. No.
Okay, so just get hungry at French times. That's it.
Get your stomach ready for French time.
Exactly. Okay, another thing is that French people, and I thought mistakenly that more French people lived in large cities than Americans, and that's not true and I'm not sure how they counted that. But it seems to me like that more young families live in apartments in cities in France, and that it's the more affluent people who are probably older who can buy a house.
Okay, you're making the distinction between living in an apartment and living in a house.
Yes.
I think that may be true in the sense that there's more of a push maybe in the United States for people once they get to the idea of having children to move into a house and leave the city center as a component of their life. But I think that has also changed. But I think you're right that there's less push to immediately have a private house in France than there is in the States.
Right. Lots of people.
They own their apartments.
Yes.
That makes a big difference
too. Yeah. And so they just live in an apartment. Right. It's their own. But that's minor differences, I think. Oh, one more thing about work in France is that coffee breaks are sacrosanct. So this is, again, update from my daughter, who is still doing this every day. When she gets to work, she has to immediately take a coffee break. So they gather around the coffee machine and get a coffee. And she says sometimes it takes half an hour. And sometimes they talk about work, and sometimes they talk about other things, whatever. But there's a big long coffee break at her company. It's right when you arrive at work. And then there's another one in the afternoon.
I think that's interesting because, of course, there's the institution of the coffee break in the States, but it's always mid-morning. I think it's usually 10:30 in the morning. And if you take it for longer than 15 minutes, it's considered to be that you're slacking off.
Yeah.
Get back to your desk, whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Well, and nowadays people, they can track every click, every mouse,
right.
Whatever. I don't think that's happening so much in France either. Like, it's fine. You can go to the office, chit-chat with your coworkers for half an hour at the coffee machine, then get your work done. If you really need another coffee, no, they just don't go back.
Don't go back.
They don't go back. And then they go to lunch and have their coffee with lunch, obviously. And then later in the afternoon, they can take another half-hour coffee break. It's better than taking a smoking break. It's healthier for you, as I'm sure. So there you go. That's a big one. And if you did not participate in the coffee break, you would be seen as a weirdo.
Yes. Well, there is more pressure in general, I would say, in French society to be part of the group.
Yes.
All of these things that we're talking about indicate that, it's like you should not be different from people. It sometimes can be hard if you as Americans really prize their individuality. And the idea that you have to do this because everybody does it, it can sometimes, I have found that there are times when it's like, do I really want to do this? It's hard.
Yeah. And when you are in that group, anymore in French companies, you have to say tu to everybody. There are very few situations, and this is a huge change, because when I was working in companies, it was vous for work. At least you started that way until somebody told you, please, let's do tu. Nowadays, the default is tu. And the default is back to kissing people on the cheeks when you arrive. It's not as mandatory as it used to be because of COVID, but it's back. So you show up, you go find your coworkers at the coffee machine, you kiss everybody, and you have your coffee and you chit chat about whatever. And sometimes it's going to be about work. You know, sometimes it will be about work, but not every day.
I really have to admit that after all my years of living here, I really hate that. I really do. And now that the COVID has come and more or less gone, not completely, obviously, I think that elbowing is fine. And that's my excuse for elbowing people.
Yeah, because America, you can just walk up to people and
say
say,
hi.
Hey, how you doing? Here, you cannot. You have to kiss them.
There are some people I just don't want to do that. Now.
That's true. That's true. But that's how it is. Vacations are sacred in France.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So there are people who choose their job based on vacations. Even young people, they just go, okay, what's the profession I should pick that allows me to have vacation and long weekends?
The first time I heard a young person say that, I thought it was a joke. I really did. And then I realized, no, that person was serious. It really makes a big difference for them. They would rather have long vacation and earn less. And that's the bottom line.
Yes, yes. They want to take at least 3 weeks in a row in the summer.
And have 1 or 2 during the winter.
And then in the winter, a couple of weeks. And kids have several, vacation times throughout the year. And a lot of parents, they will either, one parent will take those 2 weeks off, the other one will take the next batch, or sometimes the kids go stay with the grandparents or things like that. But vacations are sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct. Really.
And when people go on vacation, they do not respond to emails. They do not return your calls. They do not check Facebook. They do not do any of that. They just have a vacation.
And really and truly, I think that France would have a second revolution if the government decided to stop vacations.
Yes.
That's all.
People were very, very, and this has come back even stronger after COVID because people were cooped up. They could not go anywhere. A lot of French people are rediscovering vacations here in France. So when you go out to big sites of interest, you see as many French people as foreigners, which is a good thing. You know, it's wonderful. And some of them just visit from the next department over or something. They're not necessarily coming from very far, but they do take their vacations and their long weekends. And if you plan to come to France in May, especially, sometimes it's June as well, check the schedule for the long weekends. And I always talk about that on the podcast as well, because it will mess you up. Like you'll wonder, why are all the hotels full? Like what's happening? And it's because it's a long weekend. And French people are booking up those rooms well ahead because they want their primo spot and they look forward all year to going to X, Y, and Z for the long weekend in May. The first one or the second one or the third one. We usually have 3 long weekends in May. So these are really important for people.
When my sister was planning the trip to Provence for this past May, she did not know it and booked her arrival for one of the long weekends and had so much trouble. There was some, I think, restaurant or hotel she wanted to go to. And it was all filled. And this was a year before. And finally, I went on to the French calendar because it's not on an American calendar. And I went, that's why. There you go. So
I probably should
do have to
do
know
newsletters about that because that would be
calendars.
helpful. Yeah, the French calendar. Yeah, that would be helpful to do.
And the other thing about, of course, since COVID is that not only are French people doing more vacations inside country, which had to do with restrictions and going out, but they're rediscovering things like the mountains and places that they know are there, but starting to appreciate more.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. So if there is someone in your company who loves his or her vacations instead of you slacker. Like the attitude is completely different. Because I remember when I worked in high-tech companies in the US, there was always this kind of, people were suspicious of the people who would go off on vacation or take days off
Yes.
too much.
That's
like
right.
they were slackers, they were not part of the team, not a team player, blah, blah, blah. It's the opposite in France.
It is really the opposite. I had an unfortunately bad experience with that, but this is going back already over 25 years ago. This is when I did my Fulbright exchange, and I was teaching in a high school in France, and the person whose post I took was teaching in my high school in New York. And she unfortunately had an incident where she got mugged, which is really unfortunate. But what happened was she used it as an excuse because she wasn't hurt. She just got scared, luckily for her. But she went to a doctor. In France, there's what they call an arrêt de travail.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the States. If you have a serious injury, there's a specific agency that deals with injuries. And so you get time off and you get paid. But she actually went to a doctor and asked for 4 weeks off. And she really was justified in taking 3 or 4 days off. And she got into a lot of trouble. And the people, the whole rest of the crew she was working with, they could not understand why she would take all this time off. And so it became a real issue. And it made me realize, because I was working in France.
But this was in the US, right?
This was in the US.
Yes.
And I was here doubling up on work in the high school where I was teaching. And I thought, wow, that's really an interesting difference, because here in France, if you have an arrêt de travail, nobody can say anything to you about it.
Yeah. And nor would it occur to them. I mean, some people really abuse the privilege. So, but if not, it's just done. Like, that's how it is. But especially when it comes to just using the vacation you have, because it's to the point where Americans don't even use the vacation that they're entitled to because there's so much pressure to be part of the team and stay on, even though the weather is glorious and you would like to go boating or something, you know? Yeah. My daughter, we were discussing this episode with my daughter, and she had a fun example. She says, so a few years ago, she was a camp counselor in a U.S. Camp. They were taking care of, it was a camp for kids with handicaps. And she was one of the counselors. And there was another French girl in the camp. And Marianne relates that the French girl said to one of the American counselors, why don't we go out and get a drink? And so the American counselors went and got her truck. They got into the truck. She went to the drive-up window of some sort of fast food place nearby. And that was the let's get a drink, was to drive the drive-up window. And the French girl was like, I want to go to a cafe or something.
Right.
Sit somewhere nice and have a drink.
Well, part of that, I was just thinking, because we were just talking about this a couple of minutes ago, part of that is that unless you go to a big city in the States, there is no cafe culture. Here, even though many tiny villages no longer have a cafe, but that's because there are not enough people to sustain it economically.
Yeah.
It's still a culture where, like in Spain, you go out and you can sit over a drink. It doesn't have to be alcohol. It can be any kind of drink at all.
Yeah.
But you sit outside somewhere and you talk and you hang out for a while. And there are lots of places in the States where that doesn't exist.
Apparently, in some places it happens, but it's unusual.
Big cities. I think in cities you can do that.
Maybe vacation towns.
Maybe vacation towns,
Yeah.
I think that one of the things is that you get not to bring in brands, but the whole culture that has grown up around things like Starbucks has changed that a little bit, because Starbucks is just about everywhere. And even though it's basically based on coffees and teas and sweets and things like that, it's a place where you're encouraged to hang out.
Yeah.
So that has changed things a little bit. But you're right. There are zillions of places in the States where there is no such place to hang out unless you go to a bar.
Yeah. And on the other hand, French bookstores typically do not have a cafe.
Right.
Which is very different,
Yeah.
And when I discussed this with a bookstore owner, one of the major ones in Toulouse, he said he was worried about people, taking books and staining them and damaging them. Because if they haven't exited, they don't have to buy it. Like, they could just be reading it while they're having their coffee, stain it, and then... So he was still worried about that. And this was quite a few years ago. And still to this day, there are very few bookstores with coffee places inside. And that surprises Americans. One of the big exceptions to that is Shakespeare and Company in Paris, because, and even that is pretty recent. They put in a cafe next door maybe 5 years ago, a few years ago anyway. For the longest time, there wasn't a cafe next to it. And so now you can just go hang out there. So it's a very different, we have cafes everywhere, but not where you might expect them. French people have a very different approach to money. Their relationship to money is quite different. A lot of French people are just like, you can't take it with you kind of attitude is very prevalent here. So people will want to have enough money to live, but they don't really go for $1 million. I mean, like, you never see people say, I want to be a millionaire by the time I'm 30. I mean, there might be a few, but it's odd. Like, it's not the same.
Well, I think the difference to me, there are two differences. One is that you don't hear a lot of people claiming, like here, you would say, I want a job that gives me a lot of vacation, but you don't have a lot of people focusing on earning a living as a choice of career. But the other thing is that, and this is really, I've been quite impressed by, and I'm saying that as a neutral sense, people here have an attitude of more, I'm going to put money away to leave to my children. And in the States, people spend their money and they get themselves often in debt because they use a lot of credit cards. You don't have a lot of people with a lot of credit cards here in France. And most of the people I know will spend their money judiciously, and they don't just spend their money. They don't just go out and spend.
Right.
And they save money, and saving is very important, and it offers a certain assurance of stability. And I know a lot of people who talk about, well, I'm not going to spend all of this because I want my kids to have this kind of money. That is not the attitude of a lot of Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, saving, this is one of the reasons why the French economy will never be as good as the American economy, is that French people are not into consumerism. So once they have a perfectly fine TV, they're going to keep it until the TV dies, which could be 15 years.
That's true. But it's interesting you consider that not having a good economy. The fact is that French banks are safer than American banks.
That's possible. I don't know. But I'm by good economy, I mean, like, it's not, obviously, the standard of living.
As dynamic.
Right. It's not as dynamic.
Right.
The standard of living, people don't change their cars constantly. Right. People don't upgrade their sound systems. They have a house. They have a fine house.
Right.
And people do spend a lot of money on their private homes. Like, I live in a village where, almost everybody has a pool, but they don't have a McMansion to go with it.
Right.
So it's a different relationship to money.
To me, it's more conservative. I don't think it's bad necessarily. I think that it's interesting that the idea is you don't just spend your money, and you certainly don't go into debt over too many purchases. You really don't. But the other aspect of it we've talked about is that you don't talk about how much you earn ever.
Yes.
It's a no-no. And nobody will ever ask you.
No, they don't ask you, and you're not supposed to tell.
Not supposed to tell.
You'd be bragging.
Don't talk about money.
Yeah, don't brag. You mentioned credit cards earlier, and I want to make sure that this is very clear to everybody. French people have a plastic thing that looks like a credit card, but it's almost never a real credit card. It's a debit card. So it's a card that you can use to make purchases, but you pay it off at the end of the month.
Exactly.
Each month.
It's not a rolling credit.
Exactly. It's not a rolling credit. And this is one of the reasons why Americans sometimes used to, anyway, it's getting better all the time, but used to get in trouble when using machines that take credit cards, because setting up machines for a debit card is very different than setting it up for a real credit card, American style credit card. And we don't have those cards in France. And so when you come to France, bring a debit card. It's really important that you bring a debit card. And it's even more important if you can link that debit card to either Google Pay or Apple Pay, because contactless payments are everywhere.
Yes.
And they work all the time. Like, I don't know what the magic is, but sometimes it's the same credit card, because when you set up contactless, you're going to set up your credit card. It'll just go through your iPhone or your Apple Watch or Android phone or whatever. And once you set it up that way, anywhere that takes contactless will take it. Whereas if you just try to use the physical card, It may not work. It's weird, but that's how it is.
But let me just make an addendum to that, because it is a fact that you have to be careful not to confuse a debit card and a credit card. I sometimes use my American credit card for purchases here when there are significant purchases, especially when I'm on vacation, because I do have that. And you can do that, but you have to be careful that it's not for taking money out. Do not ever use that American credit card for taking money out. You don't want to do that. You need to do it with a debit card.
Yes. Yes, that is very true. So you mentioned that you don't ask about how much money people make.
No, you don't.
You do not. And you do not ask them about their religion either.
No.
That's a big no-no here, which it is not in America. Maybe it's because I lived in Utah.
No, I think it's more common. At least my experience was, and as you have said, I haven't been back in a while, but it seems to me that it's just more common as a basic subject of conversation. In the States, it's perfectly correct socially to find out what people's religious background is, not necessarily whether they're still practicing.
Right.
But you can bring it up and ask it, just like in the States, people can ask, where did your family originally come from? It's kind of a basic thing that people do, you know, is it 2, 3, or 4 generations back? Where did they come from?
Right. So if you look Asian and people ask you, where are you from? And you say, I'm from California, and they insist. But no, where are you really from?
Right. Yeah. In France, people would take offense at that.
Yes.
But in the States, it's just something people do.
Yeah.
You know, there's this basic assumption that it's really okay. And then you just go on to talk about something else. It's no big deal.
It's so much of a no-no that you can't even ask for people's religion in the French census. So, you know, they don't. And it has disadvantages, because if the French census actually asks people what religion they would like to associate with, then it would be easier to do stats about possibly some religious groups being discriminated against or things of that nature.
And also it would help demographic studies to understand how many people associate with particular groups.
Right, right. So they don't ask you, and I've never been in a situation where people ask me, you know, Protestant or Catholic or in France. No, but ever. No, it wouldn't occur to people to ask that. That's a really private question.
It's a very private question, but the opposite of that, and I don't know if it's still true, but when I first came back to live in France and was applying for jobs, they have the right to ask you, if you're a woman, if you are married or not. And I took offense at that, because in the States, you are not allowed to.
Also, French resumes, still to this day, usually they encourage you to include a picture.
A picture and your date of birth.
Yes. So it's a problem because
of prejudice.
Yeah, because of your ageism, racial discrimination, things like that. They don't anonymize for names in exams or in, like, if you apply for a job, well, they're going to know what your name is, your real name. And so they can infer a lot from a name. Like, come on, we all do it. These are things where we could stand to make progress. But on the other hand, something that's totally okay to discuss in France is politics.
Yes.
In America, it didn't used to be okay to discuss politics. I have the impression that it's changed recently in the last 5-10 years, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
But in France, it's always been fine to discuss politics. And you actually tease people when you know that they like a politician that you can't stand. You know, it's totally fine to just say, oh, your name favorite politician, they're too dumb to see this, or they're going to be in favor of that, or whatever. And people never really get angry with each other about this. It's very different. Like, okay, recently I had somebody tell me he wanted to join Facebook with a completely different name because he didn't want friends and family to be able to find him on Facebook, because he knows he's going to be annoyed by their political things. And so he made up a name and made up a completely new persona on Facebook, just not to be annoyed by all the politics. And in France, they just like to talk politics.
They like to talk. I mean, I've had discussions around the table with good friends and family that can turn into what an American would consider to be an argument. But it is almost an exercise it's almost like an intellectual exercise. Everybody has a glass of wine. Everybody starts to talk. Everybody starts to get a little bit agitated about their particular political position or opinions. And then they have another glass of wine and the whole thing is all over. And just that's the end of that.
Yeah. And they don't get mad at each other. There's no threatening to cut you off, never see you again, never talk to you again. It's just a thing like you can, like I mentioned, you can tease people that you know are going to disagree with you on politics, but they will ask you to argument, to actually just tell them, why do you think this? And they will usually let you talk about it for quite some time before the conversation comes to a dead end, because it always does. You're never going to convince somebody to change their politics.
No, you're not, unfortunately. No.
But you do kind of tell them but I don't see it that way because of this and because of that. And that's totally fine. So it's a very different kind of interaction within groups of friends or family gatherings or things like that. So you might ask, what are acceptable topics to discuss with people you've just met, right? When you're in France, for you visiting, maybe perhaps you're hoping to stay here for a few months, for possibly a few years. So acceptable topics for people you just met are food. We love to talk about food. Love to talk about the food we're going to have, the food we're eating now, where we like to get our breads, where we like to get our pastries, who's the best butcher, where do you go get that one particular cut of meat? Everybody has to know.
What market do you go to?
Yeah, what market you like, things like that. So this is another thing. Americans will do lists like the top 10 bakeries in Paris. French people don't do that. They just have their favorite.
Yes.
And they'll just tell you, the bread here is just fabulous. You got to go, you got to, if you get the bread anywhere else, you're exposing yourself to just terrible pain and suffering because you won't have the nice bread that I like. And then they argue about it.
And every village has a bakery, every place. There are good pastry shops everywhere. I don't think most French people think about, this is the only one you can go to.
Well, yesterday, my husband managed to buy a terrible cake in a French bakery. So we were going out to eat with friends, and these are new friends to me anyway. He knew them, but I didn't. And so we were leaving a little bit late, and we stopped at a bakery along the way. La Panetière is a chain. And I pulled in and I stayed in the car. I should not have stayed in the car. It was a big mistake. My husband goes in and he comes out with this nice, beautiful looking cake. And he says, we're supposed to put it in the fridge until 20 minutes before we eat it. And I was like, this is part of one of these frozen cakes, that they do that. And it looked really nice from the top. And it was like a several layer of different chocolates. Beautiful. We get to dessert. The thing was like cardboard. It was the nastiest stuff. And I was like, how can you sell such horrible cakes? And I fully intend to go back to La Panetière and just do not sell this. This is terrible. Where'd you get this?
Well, that's really interesting because there are chains of bakeries. The one that most tourists would probably know is Paul, because there are Pauls everywhere in Paris, and they're pretty much everywhere in France. And down here we have a couple of chains. One of them is the Panetière. And I know for a fact that it's a franchise, so they have the name. I don't know if, for instance, the pastries and the breads are actually really made there. They make the bread. But I wonder about the pastries, whether they're not made in a central place and then distributed in some way.
Yeah.
Because it's not the same. And you have to know when it comes to a chain bakery, which ones are good and which ones are not.
Normally, I would have just bought it at my village bakery, but they're on vacation. We're recording this in August. They're on vacation. They've closed the bakery for 3 weeks.
I mean, it is a fact that just like anywhere else, you can still get a bakery that has bad bread or bad pastries. I mean, sometimes, that does happen.
But honestly, I have never bought something as bad as this.
I bet it was old.
I don't know what it was. I did not eat it. I took a bite. The guys both finished their serving. The other lady, she kind of ate some of it and then stopped. I was like, this is not worth the calories. I apologized profusely. I was like, I'm so sorry. This is terrible. So it is possible to get a bad pastry in France. We did it last night. La Panetière, shame on you. So sorry, we started talking about
We started about food and we just got stuck.
So acceptable topics to discuss with people that you just met. Food, obviously. Books. You can talk about the books that you like, the authors you like, the types of books you like. Stuff like that is great. TV shows, you can talk about TV shows, and most French people watch pretty much the same TV shows as Americans. I mean, we have extras, we have our own TV production, but yeah, travel is a favorite. So, talking about some chateau you went to see. And these days, it used to be French people would talk about their trips to, I don't know, they went to India, they went to somewhere exotic like that. Anymore, since we stay closer, they will just say, oh, I went to see this chateau, or I went to see this, that. And it's great for me because then it gives me ideas.
Do you not find that it's okay to just ask somebody what they do as a profession? I find that it's okay.
It's fine. Not the first question out of your mouth, but you could ask them, what sort of work do you do?
Yeah.
But don't get too drilling down. Like, don't, just... Yeah, what kind of work do you do? Do you more like work in farming or in?
It's like do you do
industry,
computer
tourism?
work? Do you do healthcare work?
Exactly,
that kind of thing.
That sort of thing. Yes. Another thing that's very popular to talk about is your next vacation. Just like your next meal is also very popular.
That's another thing. It is eating and talking about food at the same time.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And you can talk about your pets as well. People love to talk about their cats and their dogs and their, Now, I like to talk about hedgehogs and birds and things like that. And sometimes people look at me like, you're interested in hedgehogs?
I have one. He comes out every night at 9:00 and goes across my yard.
Do you give him water?
No, should I?
You must.
Oh, I wonder if he drinks the cat's water. Perhaps. Because there's a bowl of water out for the cat.
Yes.
Okay, I'll think about that tonight.
Yeah, a shallow dish of water.
Shallow dish, okay. Because he comes right across the same hour every night.
There you go. That's a nice hedgehog. I would like one like that. Yes, I would like one like that. Anyway, so these are some things that we thought of to discuss that are different between day life in France and in America. I hope we didn't offend anyone by making assumptions about America that are not true. It's been a long time since I've lived in America.
I think these are generalizations anyway. Obviously, there are exceptions to everything, But I think that it is true that there are certain do's and don'ts that are kind of understood in each culture.
Yeah.
For instance, I really would not know how to answer these questions about Spanish culture or Italian culture. I have no idea. So it is interesting to get an idea.
But life in France is not that different from life in America, other than overall, it's not as busy. I know a lot of people think about moving to France. And if you do that, just be prepared that unless you're moving to Paris, where there's a lot of things happening, there are a lot of events, exhibits, things that you want to do and see.
And it's speedy, it's like a big city speedy.
Yes. Life in France typically is much, much slower. Slower. Like we just don't, if you don't get a response today, like from the guy who installed our gate. So the gate broke in May. The guy came to look at the gate also in May, a few days later. That didn't take very long. He ordered the gate and told us it was going to be 7 weeks. And indeed, it was much longer than that. It was 10 weeks before he got the gate and came to install the gate. And then there was a problem with les cellules. So the cell to detect if somebody is in the path. And he said he'd come back and fix it next week. And it's August. I mean, it's been weeks. It's August. So I didn't even call him back or anything. I'll wait till September.
There you hit something that really people who are not French really need to understand. In the month of August, don't count on everything being open. Whatever it is you plan on doing, it might not be available right away. Stores close, little companies close. This is something that would never, ever happen in the States.
Yeah.
And probably not in other English-speaking countries either, to be honest.
I mean, in Paris, that's not a problem. In Paris, so much stays open that you're never going to have any trouble finding everything under the sun. But if you're in a village like me, I don't go bothering the guy. I know it's August. He'll get to it eventually. What's my hurry? So you just need to, it's really respectful to slow down and give people, especially workers, time to get the things and come install the things. And they'll do a very good job once they come, but
it may not be tomorrow.
It might not be as fast as you'd like. And such is life,
C'est la vie.
Thank you, Elise.
You're welcome, honey.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting this show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. That's PATREON. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all so much for supporting the show. Some of you have been doing it for a long time. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons: Svetlana Dickens, Michelle Wells, Steph Whitaker, Jeff and Marsha Hildenbrand. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. My thanks also to Chuck Barton for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on Join Us in France that says Tip Your Guide. Chuck wrote, in late September, we will be on the Smithsonian Tour, France Through the Ages. Ooh. Your podcast is wonderful for background on places, providing the perspective on culture and preparing us to enjoy our first trip to France. Wonderful to have you as a listener of the podcast, Chuck. If you're preparing a trip to France and listening to as many episodes as you can to get ready, just like Chuck, keep listening to the podcast because it's a great way to do it. And if you can't remember all the stuff we talk about on the podcast, and who could, search the website. You can also hire me to be your itinerary consultant. I can tell that the travel season is winding down a little bit because I'm only booked up 1 month ahead right now. It's surprising. Here's how this works. You go to joinusinfrance.com/boutique. You click on the itinerary planning section. You buy however many days or weeks you need. Then within one business day, usually I send you a form to fill out. And as soon as I get that form back from you, you can schedule a time to talk. I call you on the day and time, and we talk for at least half an hour, sometimes as long as an hour, depending on how many questions you have for me. Then I send you a written document that recaps all of the things we've discussed. Plus, it summarizes a lot of general advice about travel to France. This is advice you've heard over many episodes. You know, this is general France advice. But here it's all in one place. And plus, you can email me at any point if you have more questions. So it's a great service, especially if France is all new to you. But if you can't talk to me because I'm booked up, you can still take me in your pocket by getting my GPS self-guided tour on the Voice Map app. I've made 5 tours of Paris. They are designed to show you the very best around iconic neighborhoods of Paris. Take a look at those. joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Let's get to the travel question of the week. Steve Yetter on the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook, he said, I love France, but why do they bring you bread and butter with no bread plate? Then they come with a scraper and dustbin to clean up the crumbs and give you the stink eye? ? There were a lot of reactions to this one on the Facebook group. This is funny. It made me laugh because, yeah, it's a huge difference between American ways and French ways. The only time French people spread butter on bread is at breakfast. If you're not being served breakfast, they'll bring bread, but no butter. And French waiters by now know that it's part of service in American restaurants. Before your appetizer, they bring you bread and butter. French people would consider that just empty calories. And you know, French people, they don't want to put on a pound that they don't need to. So they don't see the point of eating a bunch of bread before your meal. That's like, why? Don't do that. It's bad for you. Okay. That's what they think. I obviously don't live by those rules, or I would not be as heavy as I am, but it's a very French thing. So yes, when they bring you bread in a French restaurant, the intention is that you will not eat it until you get your meal. It's not a free appetizer. It's something that you should eat with your meal. And also in France, we are not raised to put our bread on a plate. Bread goes on the tablecloth. Bread goes on the table. It's normal. Even at a fancy restaurant, I'm sure some of them break that rule, but typically there is no bread plate, even at a fancy restaurant. Some very fanciest restaurants have someone going around giving you a choice of different types of bread, and they will come around several times. Some places, they just have the waiter drop off a basket of bread at your table, but they really don't intend you to eat that as a snack before your meal. So that's why it's so different. Now, are there places in France where they will include butter? No. The only place where they might is Brittany, because they love butter in Brittany. But even there, I don't think they give you for lunch. They're not going to bring you bread and butter. And if they do, it's because they know you're American and they're expecting you to ask for butter. Okay? French people just don't do that. It was a funny question, but that's a very typical kind of cultural differences. And in America, I know if you're being raised properly, they're going to tell you to put your bread on a plate and just let it go. You don't need to in France. It can go on the table. It's fine. Nobody's going to slap you. So also on the Facebook group, somebody asked for help in pronouncing a proper name. And I told her I would rather say it than try to explain how to say words. It's hard to explain it without saying it. This was on a bottle of wine, and it said, Laougué, les passionnés Madiran. So Laougué was the name of the vineyard. Les passionnés is the name of this bottle, and Madiran is a type of wine. I think the one she had a hard time with was the proper name. So Laougué. So you know how to say la, où, as in where, où, where is it, où est-ce, où c'est. And then gai is the same as être gai. Par exemple, je suis gai, which in French means happy. Okay, it only means happy. Like happy and gay in English, you have that, right? It's the same word, but it's gai, not gay. So gai. So it's la ou gai. Don't think about it too much. Laougué. Deciding how to read proper names is difficult in French, especially when it comes to the silent S at the end. But in this case, I don't think there are any other ways to say this. It's Laougué, the end. So I'm not going to do French news today because this episode will get way too long. And it's mostly angst about climate change and how to deal with it, because we were hit hard this summer in France by fires, by a never-ending heat wave. It's still way too hot. Yesterday, it was in the 90s around Toulouse. It's way, way too hot. And the air is so dry. Everything is just getting burned. It's terrible. So because of that, there's a lot of angst with everybody and a lot of news reports about who's doing what, who's not doing enough, who's not doing their fair share, all of that. So there you go. That's French news for this week. And for my personal update this week, I'll also keep it short. Last weekend, Elise and I went to Lavore, a cute little town not far from Toulouse. We had a good look around. She gives tours of Lavore all the time, but I wanted to see it as well, to check out places where we want to take boot camp participants. It's really important to look around those places and imagine being there with a big group and what might actually happen with a big group. So we're doing that, and that was just doing our homework because, you know, somebody has to, and it's so rough. We get to go explore places in the south of France. I mean, such a rough life. Show notes and a full transcript for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/406. Transcripts are wonderful and they are also a pain to make. So please use them. And you can also help your Francophile friends plan their own visit to France. Go to joinusinfrance.com, click on the share buttons on the left side and tag your friend. They will thank you. Next week on the podcast, an episode with Jennifer Gruenke, where she tells us how she became the accidental Francophile and even moved to Paris. She's also one of the wonderful moderators of the Facebook group. Beautiful people that they are. I love them so much. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent
and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.